everything we do as writers is sort of sending something out into nothing and being like, I hope that
Mm.
works. I hope that's good.
Hello, creative dreamer. Welcome to today's conversation. I'm so excited to talk with Nicole Treska. She is an adjunct professor at City College, as well as a 2010 graduate of City's MFA and writing program, and we're going to dig into that. The reason Nicole is here is because of her debut memoir, Wonderland, which is forthcoming from Simon & Schuster. It's going to be coming out in the spring of 2024.
July, July.
Oh, July. Okay, thanks, Nicole. And so, yeah, we're going to be chatting about all things memoir, as well as really digging into some fears around writing, which can be pretty strong when we're writing memoir, especially if we're worried about the repercussions of what we write. And when you start to hear what Wonderland is about, you'll understand why there may have been some concerns around that. And also stick around until the end because we're actually going to be sharing information about a memoir writing competition that Nicole is judging that you guys are going to be able to enter. So, welcome, Nicole. I'm super thrilled to have you here with me.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I'm very excited to be here. This is great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. And firstly, I just want to say congratulations, Nicole, because
Thank you.
having read your memoir, I can really tell from like the many timelines that you cover, as well as the size of the cast list, that this will have been a huge project for you. So just congratulations for getting over the finish line and for getting that
Thank
book
you.
deal.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that because there's a lot going on in there and it was a big project, but yeah, we'll talk about the highs and the lows of structuring, I'm sure.
I mean, to be honest, that's kind of where I want to go. Like, I
Yeah.
really want to explore the journey of writing memoir. So I gather
Hmm.
that the book started as a novel. You mentioned before we hit record that it was short stories as well.
Yep.
And then at some point you had a writing assignment from a friend who then I believe later became your agent to start to write a series of anecdotes, which then became the memoir. So I think so many people listening, they see a finished product. Like when I read
Hmm.
Wonderland, I was like, oh my God, the way that you interweave the stories, each chapter is almost like a standalone piece, but there's interlinkings. It's so easy to look at that and think that that's how it came out. So I'd love for you to take me right back to the beginning before
Yeah.
you even knew what this project was.
Yeah. I love that. I think that is like a way of reading with craft in mind, where you realize that that must have been a complicated process because and I think that thank you because that feels like success at the end of having done all of this torturous structuring, which I'll take it back to now. So great. I'm really glad that it feels the way you described it. That's what I wanted. So that's awesome news. So actually, I think like the beginning when I had no idea was like MySpace. I used to before grad school or anything, and I've always been a writer. Like, no, it is way earlier than that. I used to like write poems that I published in like 2008, and they were, oh, am I reconnecting? Is this okay on your end? Okay, great. Um, and they would always be like, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book. And they were always sort of about my family. My aunt that you read about, Loretta, was maybe my first decision to write about the family, but it was also, I just didn't want her to be forgotten by the world, right? Like it was this like big feeling. My aunt is, or was a paranoid schizophrenic. She lived 20 plus years in various different homes. And I felt like she just had a terrible, terrible life, and nobody was going to know that she had lived. And that just really hurt me on top of the pain of what she'd been through. So I started sort of writing toward her. I think that's what I wanted to do in graduate school, which is what we had spoken about briefly, was that I had started much of this autobiographical writing. It was very much autofiction. I would call whatever the novel was autofiction, but some of my short stories were certainly fiction. They were in the third person. They were from a male perspective, from like the character of my father.
Mm.
Um, so I think I just was, for lack of a better phrase, just throwing shit against the wall for a long time and like trying to see is like, is this the way that I can talk about this the best way? Like, because as you mentioned, there's a million things going on. I took a workshop in 2019. It was pre-pandemic with Amy Hempel in Virginia. Yeah,
Dog of the
and
Marriage.
Mhm.
The Dog of the Marriage. I think that's one of her short
Yes,
story
yeah.
collections.
Yeah.
Love
She's
it.
there. Oh, she's so incredible. Like, and she was so incredible as a teacher. We were both students of Gordon Lish, and there's so much of a shared thinking and language around language. It was awesome. But I remember talking to her and being like, I don't know how to tell this story. I've been trying
Mm,
to tell it for years, and it's like, do I write like five giant books about each timeline? Do I write a condensed everything all interwoven? But how would I even do like, so these were sort of always understood issues that I didn't know the best way to tell it. And then my agent Annie DeWitt um was like, just tell me what you tell me at dinner.
mm,
Like when your dad comes to visit and leaves and you are like so frustrated but like so happy to have spent that time with him but like want to wring his neck, just like tell me about that. And I did that until I just kind of thought 200 pages is probably enough, but like I think I could have gone on and on, and that ended up being what became this book.
Wonderland.
Yeah,
Let me just go back to when you said, I don't know how to tell this story, because I
yeah,
think there's probably a lot of people who just heard that who were like, oh, thank God it's not just me. Isn't it fascinating that we know that we want to write and we have something within us, and yet it almost it doesn't, the operating instructions are not totally clear. So we have this story, but we don't always know at the beginning what kind of story it is and how we're going to tell it.
yeah. And excuse me, I would say I feel like it's like it's like a little bit like life, right? Like it's like, you want to do things, but then it's like hard and not what you thought it would be. So it is like a practice of trying to translate what, on one hand, trying to translate the story onto the page, but on the other, like life is also confusingly an unclear narrative that is fascinating and jumbled up. And I think one of the tricky things about memoir, and one of the things that is daunting, is trying to kind of iron that out, however each individual is going to do that, right? Like, because it's
Mm,
my method, and I was so against a chronological approach because I don't think memoir works, like I don't think memory and life kind of work that way. But it turned out that that's what allowed me to bring in moving timelines like this, was to have one solid through line. And I thought that was like super important in the end, but I bucked it real hard in the beginning because I was like, that's not what my memoir isn't going to do.
oh, well, that's really interesting to know, because I wanted to ask you about that, because there was a moment when I was reading Wonderland and I was probably about halfway through, and I stopped and I thought, wow, like really wow, Nicole, because I thought this book is going in many different directions. It's set A lot of it's set in Boston. There's obviously your sort of contemporary timeline in New York, places that I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
with, like I said, a really large cast list. And I was thinking to myself, how is she managing this? Like, how is she enabling me as the reader to kind of go all over the place? And I love that you just corroborated that. It's because there was that anchor. We kind of had the Nicole, obviously not the Nicole that you are today, but who was like
Sure.
renting out her Airbnb, having this doomed love affair with the Turk. So you sort of had that contemporary timeline. So you kind of could go on this sort of memory wandering and
I
come back.
wish. I wish my editor, Yadon Israel, was here because this was the fight. We fought. We fought. And I was like, this isn't the story. The story isn't about me. It's about my family. And he's like, it's a memoir, you dum dum. It's obviously about you. And that I also find it very validating. I mean, he was right, and I could tell he was right as soon as I started to realize the ability it provided me to move around in other ways because then it was clear where we were. And that was his thing from the beginning. And I think with all creative work and with really good editorial, which is not always the case, and I'm very, very lucky that I have Yadon as an editor because otherwise I don't think the book would read the way I know it wouldn't read because
Mm.
I couldn't have done this conceiving of what would carry the story on my own. I didn't know because it's mine. And I would argue that every memoirist is going to have this, maybe not this problem, but consideration of like, how do I tell this story? What is the vehicle that will carry this story the most effectively? And it was really awesome for me to have you, Dawn, to be able to sort of be like, it's here, it's you in this timeline. And then I
Mm.
realized it was all sort of there already. And it was just expanding
Hmm.
certain pieces to like the whole prologue is new. That was also, I thought, a very helpful way into this complicated narrative. So I think a lot of work in editorial after the book was acquired was done so that you feel that way. And I am psyched to hear that because it was crazy. I had like three little mental breakdowns. Little,
Well,
yeah.
let's dig into those. Like,
Yeah.
actually, hearing about Yadon and the collaborative process between you, because that was something I wanted to ask you about. Because
Hmm.
actually, in the acknowledgements, you say, "I cannot thank my editor enough. Without this book, without you, as in Yadon Israel,
Hmm.
this book would still be coiled in my mind." So now I'm like, okay, he was really the one who helped you tell the
Yeah.
story.
It was Annie and Yadana, and that's why they're up front. Is that and Gordon Lish, who's also in the book. But like I think that in terms of who is driven the project, Annie made me write it, and then Yadon made me rewrite it. And
Mm.
I think that it is those two things that got this particular book out, which I didn't, like I said, I didn't know how to tell that story. I have other short stories. I have, I had breast cancer a few years. I actually had breast cancer during the sale and contracting and like editing of the book. So it was this like wild. I always thought the book deal would be the like most explosively awesome thing in my life, and
Mm.
it just ended up being like a life raft in that particular
Mm.
moment, which was also great. Thank God, like I needed it,
Mm.
but it's a funny, it's funny how life works. But I feel like that timeline will be much easier. It's like 2 years. I can write about it. I can do anything after having to figure out something to do with all of that mayhem of memory and family and timelines and casts and all those things you talked about.
Yeah.
Wild.
It's interesting because I'm wondering because now I'm getting a sense, okay, you're working on your second memoir about your
I'm
breast cancer.
thinking,
Okay, you're
thinking
thinking
about it.
about it. I'm curious what you think about this, Nicole. The idea that maybe the first one is always a bit of a shit fest
Yeah.
because it's like there's this whole life. We've got this urge to be a writer. We've got stories that we want to tell. Versus like when we get that out off our chest, there's less material left. It's almost like we catch up to where we are now. And then we're like, oh, okay, so now I'm just going to tell a memoir of like the more recent things because everything else has been explored. Do you think it does get easier or
I don't, yes and no. I think I agree with all of that. I think there's something really true to thinking like, especially with memoir, especially with the first memoir. I have friends whose memoirs are their second or third book. My friend Tracy's book comes out, Woman of Interest, 2 weeks before mine. It's her third book, and she was like, memoir. Like, after two novels. So I think that, yes, a memoir particularly is a very difficult thing to write. I think if it's your first book, which for many people it can be, because that is what you're doing, right? You're processing and thinking a lot about how you got here. And I absolutely think once you have looked at that, I don't think it gets, I think what gets easier is that we've been through the process. So we
Mm.
learn what we learn about craft and editing and like even stuff like marketing and kind of like that stuff that doesn't seem as fun. But I think your gaze just moves, right? Like you're not going to talk
Yeah.
about the same thing over and over again, even if you are, like, even if you're obsessed with like love, your gaze will move from the family to a partner or to like nature or life or something bigger than or different than the last thing you looked at. So yeah, I think it gets easier from a craft perspective in some ways, but then I just think we turn and look at something else.
Yeah, for sure. I like that. I want to dig in a little more to the content of the
Hmm.
memoir. There's a couple of things that really interested me, and I know this will be something that the viewers will be experiencing themselves. We've got this idea of, okay, what happened, and when there's a cast list as large as yours, you're going to have various different versions of what happened. And then when you add into that certain cast members in your story are a little bit frisky with the truth.
That's a
So
nice way to
this
put it. Yeah.
so this idea of like your version of the story versus other people's, and I actually really like the way that you kind of bring that into Wonderland so that you do end up, for me, you really felt like the reliable narrator. So again, we had that
Good.
anchor of
Yeah.
you. I was like, I sort of sat and I was like, okay, we know that Phil is being, your father is being super frisky with the truth. You've got your aunt, ha ha, and I was like, I don't know, is she trustworthy? And then we've got your mum. But I really thought to myself, actually, I want to side with Nicole's version because you really had me on board. And so I thought that was a really, I mean, whether you did that intentionally or not, again, it was like a way that I felt anchored in the story. But I love how you bring this unreliableness in. So I'm going to sort of talk about the doggy story. You had your pet
Yeah.
dog and it had that sort of hole in it, and your aunt Ha Ha is saying, okay, there's a reason that your pet dog had this hole in it because your father was selling drugs out of this dog. And then when you questioned your father, he was like, what the heck? Who do you think I am? And then when you questioned your mother, she was like, that's outrageous. But yeah, I think that was a really interesting moment to be like, okay, we as the reader are being shown, actually, I don't know whose version to believe, and maybe nobody's version is believable. So I'm really curious as to what your process was with the truth, how you portray that, and how you portray the different versions of what stories each of the characters are talking about.
Yeah. Um, So, to the truth, I always felt like I come from a very big family of narrators and characters, right? And that is kind of evident in the book. And I think they're all kind of myth makers and they tell these big stories. And when you're a child, you believe all of them, right? Like, and you don't ask questions about them. But then suddenly, and I think in a family like mine, even as a kid, you're like, okay, yeah, but that's weird. um, and so I think we grew up with a really high value on the truth about honesty from our parents, but it was never sort of matched by the information that we got back. So I think friskiness with the truth is a good way to put it, because I very much grew up knowing that like my father lies about all sorts of stuff, like to girlfriends. He's like, I got 3 girlfriends, I love lying to them, and it's like it brings him like pleasure in like a
Mm,
small in small things, but then in very big things he's like a super honest, he's the most honest person I know. And that kind of relationship to the truth is complicated, right? Like, and I
mm,
think that there is in that story about Doggy, what initially happened, and this is what I rendered in that chapter, was that, Haha told me, I told Phil, he was like, whoa, whoa, I don't know what you're talking about. But he also said, if I did it, I only did it once or twice. And I did it because, I like, and so like suddenly it's not just denial, there's like admission.
mm,
Um, and then like, well, why would Haha even know this? Why would she tell me this? What interest is it of hers 30 years later to be like, your dad did X? Like,
mm.
so there was always this sense of like denial, but plausible. So it became like a choice. Like, who do
Yes.
you choose to believe? And for me, with the truth, because of these big characters and storytellers, my version was never um, central, right? Like, I was like, and I'm like a very dominant personality too, just like everybody else in my family. And I grew up very much like with my own ideas of how things were, and reading the situation the way I read the situation, and having people be like, no, no, no. So, like, I
Mm,
have always doubted them, but I also always doubted my own truth because of them, right? There was a lot, I don't think that we really used the word gaslighting at the time,
mm,
and I don't think it was intentional in a lot of ways, but like in many ways, my narrative and my truth was denied. Like, I love my mother dearly, but just the other day she said, well, you only spent 5 short years in Boston. So, like, as a way of being like, well, like whatever you think happened there is probably not true. So I feel like in terms of also how other people involved in this story read this story, and truth into this story is a really complicated thing that I think was only achievable because I needed to be the one telling the story for fucking once. And that's it. And like to just be like, I don't care what you all think, because like I have lived this life too, and it has been nuts
mm,
for us. And I think I talked in the book like, my story gets minimized a lot because everybody in my life had a very much bigger, harder story in terms of suffering, in terms of inequity.
mm.
So, people deny me my experiences a lot because theirs were way worse. So they're like, you're fine. And that,
Yeah.
you know,
It's interesting though, Nicole, because when I was reading the book, you felt like such a democratic narrator. You felt so giving. Like I'm listening to you now, and what occurred to me is, oh, there are so many memoirs out there that feel like someone saying, look at me, like, oh my God, I need this cathartic experience of telling my story and nobody else's because I so
hmm
need to be seen. But I didn't get that from reading your memoir. It felt like such a calm portrayal of like, well, this is my experience, but actually I'm also going to share what my mum said and what Phil said, and you didn't seem to be fighting for your version, and maybe in a way that's what made you the version that I wanted to listen to, because I it's
yeah.
almost like the lady doth protest too much, because you weren't protesting too much. I was like, yeah, I'm with her actually.
I love that. Thank you. I mean, I feel like again, Don really had to drag me into this book. I was talking about them for very early drafts, almost exclusively, and what their lives meant to me. And I think one thing, like, so the doggy example, I put it in the book initially because my auntie told me, and then Phil sort of like acknowledged, but like was like, yeah, whatever. But then it became like everyone was like had these different opinions, and I was like, I can't put this in as like something that happened because I didn't know about it, and then I learned about it, and then Phil sort of said, yeah, that happened, but then he was like, no, that didn't happen, and then my mom like, so it suddenly became this like sinkhole of perspectives and stories, and instead of taking it out, I just, because I love it, right? I love it as a story. I love it because it's about my doggy, and I love doggy so much, but I also was like, the shit is exactly what I'm talking about, right? And
Mm,
like the ability to sort of render it as it is, and not through like a scene of clarity, but rather like a scene of like confusion about what the
mm,
truth is, felt so easy and much more natural to the truth, which is that who knows the truth? And I think that's my relationship to the truth.
yeah. And that very much
You
comes
know?
across. I love that. It was so nice to dig into that. It
Cool.
kind of makes, like, I'm thinking now, one of the things I wanted to discuss today was that fear of repercussion. So
Hmm.
we're segueing from, telling versions of the story and what will people think into like really sort of exposing or sharing things that have been secret for a long time. And actually the example that struck me was, and I can still sort of picture it, your mother showing showing you the scars on her back where she's been picking herself, and she's like,
Hmm.
Nicole, don't tell anybody. And there's this beautiful extract, I've got it here. um, my mother kept her heart and her pain to herself too. And somehow she ended up with a real mouth runner for a daughter. Here I am. I let the cat out of the bag. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, because obviously for a long time you were seeing things, you were hearing things that you were either like, well, that's weird, or you kind of knew that you were holding on to a secret. So
Hmm.
how did that feel to be the one who lets the cat out of the bag? Like you even said, I am the snitch who gets stitches, a scourge against zit lips. So you were being, you were being quite you were sort of being attacking yourself, but I didn't feel like you were being a snitch again. So I'm curious as to
Right.
how you really
Yeah.
saw yourself and what that process was like.
But I am to them. Like right to mine, to us. I have done a terrible, terrible thing by talking about, I say in the book, it's like we don't talk about shit because it's too hard. Like there's
Mm,
too much, and things are secret for reasons that are not uh malicious, right? But like our attempts to be protective. But what ends up kind of happening in that is that everybody is reinforcing that you don't talk about it. And like
mm,
everybody, and that is the basis upon which abuse is founded, right? And like abuse is, I think when, again, you come from a family and a lineage of abuse, because Boston is a lineage of abuse, it is abuse in its institutions, abuse in its destruction of people's homes, and like the class divisions and race divisions in Boston are historical and really bad. And then that drives secrets for decades and generations, and the product of those secrets are are can be rotten. And
mm,
like they can also not be rotten, but there's a lot of rot in keeping secrets. And I think that for me, it was my job. I think I mentioned I was conscripted, right? Like I think it is the job of daughters and families like mine to be an accomplice to keeping things the way that they are. So like that passage to me, and my mom, that was a really poetic way of being like, my mom is going to be fucking pissed. Cause like that's hers, right? Like that's hers, but it's mine too, because I
mm,
carried it for her and I was asked to keep secrets. And I think that asking is something that is impossible not to do when this is the pain you're dealing with. but also is in and of itself sort of inflicting a certain kind of punishment on the person who then has to take that and say, okay, well, yeah, I'll just never tell anybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. You know, so I think for me, I will say this. I have still protected many, many secrets, and
Mm,
I have kept so much out of that book for the
mm,
respect of my family and the love of my family and their requests.
mm,
But I wasn't gonna keep it all. Like I can't
mm,
anymore, you know? It's like I'm 44. It's
mm,
like I don't care about what you think anymore. I've been in therapy.
mm.
So it's like you have to eventually either hold it in and get that rot yourself or just, let it out.
But I love the way that you made that distinction of, okay, that's hers, but it's also mine. Like when you see it like that as a memoirist, I think that's such a beautiful way of putting it, Nicole, that actually, if you're holding someone's secret, it's also yours and you also have
Yeah.
something to talk about. It's kind of making me think about what I picked up around boundaries when I was reading the book. And I'm really curious as to, like, I'd like to just sort of dive into that finally. There's an amazing quote. After I read these sentences, I just sort of sat there for a bit to really understand what it must have been like for you, but also the process of writing the book. So you say, I needed to save my life from my family, immediate and extended. So even then I was like, oh, we're not just talking about like mum and dad and siblings. It's like you're protecting boundaries beyond that. Every last one of them wanted and wanted, filled up with need. The problem was that I was filled with need too, and I couldn't meet theirs at the expense of my own anymore. And I just thought that was such a great way to put it, like to really show the reader it's like it's them or me. And I'm really getting to a place where I'm valuing me enough, but I'm curious, like, how has the book helped with the cleansing of that, that dynamic and giving you back to you?
Hmm. Um, I don't think it has. I don't think there'll ever not be, um, that maybe isn't a blanket statement. In ways, it's been incredibly, its own therapy, right? To like think about these things and what my boundaries are versus maybe what they should be. But I think in terms of like giving myself or my life back to myself, I think I am one thing that the book that made the book better and made that passage clearer was that my sister arrived into the house to live with my husband and I for 4 months as she went through her own crises, my little sister,
Mm,
Chelsea. And I was editing the book at the time, and I just realized, like, we're cyclically taking care of each other. And that care is what the love is, even though everybody is struggling so much. It's like it was very hard for her to be here and not in her own life. It was very hard for us in our we've been married like 2 months to like have like a roommate for a while, but like the end product of that was like such strength, and it was such a valuable, taxing for everybody, but valuable experience to have while I was editing, because I realized, like, oh, this is my life. My life is when I think I have it together, um, somebody is gonna need me, and like, and if I don't provide them with what they need, then like, who will, right? Like, and that is in ways can be damning, but in other ways to me is like what we're supposed to do for people we
mm,
love. And what my parents taught me, right? Like that's what they did for people they loved. So I do think that's like a lesson that I got from my family very much.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the way that they respond to your other sister's situation with her husband,
Mm-hmm.
the way that your mum moves in, the way that your dad moves in, and the financial support. Like, I was really able to see, I was like, oh, okay, it's not like a one way, actually. Like, everyone's kind of opening up boundaries for everybody, and
Yeah.
everyone's just all in on trying to help everyone.
And it's a fucking mess when that happens, right? But that like it's like that's sort of like it's like I think people can I think one of the things Yadon and I talk about a lot with the book is like a lot of times people with complicated families, which is probably every family to some extent, maybe not to the extent of mine, but like everybody's family is complicated. I think you realize like if you want to have a life that is less complicated, you can do that by not having these people in it, right? And
Mm,
like I kind of engage with that as well, where it's like I have complicated relationships with members of my family that are not always, we don't have easy relationships, but we also still can't like shake each other. Like
mm,
Phil just, Phil was everywhere.
mm,
And that's very, to me, um, that is very redemptive to
mhm.
have people who are flawed to the extent that we are all flawed, but still do everything in their power to like take care of one of their own who is down. So I do think, you know, people are complicated.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I want to pan out a little bit for a moment, Nicole, because in a moment I want to talk about this memoir prize. And
Mm-hmm.
one thing I'm aware of is you've been talking about how you were working with your agent on the structure of the book, and then when you started the collaboration with your Don. But often the way that it takes place is that someone would have to work on that before even sending a proposal to an agent.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious if you had this story and you had to put a proposal together, because as I was reading the book, I was like, I wonder what Nicole's proposal for this book. Like, I wonder who she saw as being the ideal audience for this book, like who she was writing the book for. Because I know that when people enter the memoir prize that we're going to talk about, that's something that they will need to put in their proposal.
Yeah.
They'll need to send obviously a sample of the writing. They'll need to know what the structure of the book is, and they'll need to be able to talk about who the book is for. So we've got a sense that your structure was to have a through line and then bounce around. But if you were to talk about who the book was for, what would you say?
I think that's a great question, and one that I also think when I think writers do need to think about, because I don't know that we do. I think we're like, I have a story and I'm going to tell it, and you don't always think about who you're telling it to, right? Like I think often you're thinking about, like you said, working through particular things in your life. But when I applied with this memoir early on for like, I applied for a Whiting Award, which I did not receive. I applied for like various with the document as a draft. And I don't think I still quite could articulate that early in the process. So I think it's a really good question because I think as writers, we're often like, I know the story I'm telling, but I can't sort of zoom out and tell you the bullet points
Mm,
and like or at least for me as a writer, I hope to God the rest of you are great at this because it would make things a
no, but
lot
I
easier, to be able to say this is what I'm writing about and this is who I'm writing to. But I think,
I think you're right that a lot of
yeah,
people early in the process don't know this.
no,
It's almost like because of the agent submission, writers are being asked, what's the phrase, to put the horse before the cart or the cart before the
yeah,
horse. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah,
But it's
absolutely,
almost like you
yeah.
need to like have written the whole thing and had lots of collaborative conversations with people, and then you're like, oh, now I know who this book is for and what
Well,
it's about.
so I will say to that point, a writing group is a very valuable thing. I have been in my writing group. We started off all of us, well, not all of us anymore, but the core of the group started off in Gordon Lish's workshops at the Center for Fiction in 2010. So this group has been going for 15 years, and we have like Mitchell Jackson has a Pulitzer now. Kim Parsons' second novel is coming out. So in many ways, I am the last of the group that's like, like, hey guys, I got my book here. And like, it's been a very successful group. But one of the things that they have been so helpful at is seeing how I'm writing the book. And we have these conversations about, is this for a literary audience? Is this for a general readership? And how do you sort of not only express what the book's about, but like write the book based on that and who's
Mm,
reading it? So I think to answer the question for the sake of people who are entering something like the Memoir Prize or anything where you have to sort of elucidate your book's mission, I suppose. I think it's very helpful also from a structural and craft level to do that early, even if, as you said, it's putting the cart before the horse. I think trying to think about like, am I writing? Yadon put it this way the other day. Um, Toni Morrison was writing to and for Black women. James Baldwin was writing to white audiences for Black people, right? Like, so,
mm,
like, it's sort of like thinking about, like, who are you trying to talk to with this book? And I think for
mm,
me, this book has a lot to do with class and the harrowing effects of lower class living on a family, right? Like
mm,
what those effects are. So I am to my mind, speaking from that group, but to a larger audience who I think hold a lot of stereotypes
mhm.
and a lot of assumptions about those people. So I think that once I understood that, it made the telling easier. So I do think like these awards can be really useful um, beyond the possible, like as you've experienced, the benefits of winning one. I think the elucidation of the project can be a really helpful one to like you said earlier, getting across the finish line because it is yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, just to touch on the benefit of those awards, I think, and you will have experienced this too from having your short fiction published, which I
Yeah,
know got you interest from agents. I
yeah.
think firstly it's like it's a boost, isn't it, to place or to win something. But I
Mm-hmm.
think also when you've got the deadline of an award,
Mm-hmm.
it means that you've got to get your shit together.
Yeah,
It means that you've got to dust up the manuscript and put it into some semblance of order. So I think even just that, having the deadline
yeah.
that's asking for clarity on structure, clarity on who your audience is, when you wouldn't necessarily do that when you're really bogged down in the writing process.
Well, and also that you're bonkers enough to do that without being given the assignment first, right? Like writers are sort of like, oh, is there an award that I need to sit down and write 500 pages and clarify it to myself? It's like, I think also if you are the like, and there is such a like it's such a silly hope that we have that kind of drives this whole thing that I think that as you continue to do things like apply to contests, send your work out to agents. I've been in the blurb process with the book, and I've realized I was walking my dog today and I was like, I just sent like 30 little hopes out into the world, and I have no idea of what they'll reap. And all I can
Mm,
do is have done it. And I think that
mm,
it's that doing that makes you a writer. It's not the
mm,
accolades or the publication. Like I was a writer before I got the book deal for, my whole life, but really like at least since 2010, 11, working at that as like a professional endeavor. And it's 2024 the book is coming out. So it's not in any way um something you accomplish without a bit of delusional um desire and hope and all of these wonderful things. So I think also applying to these contests keeps you going from just the perspective of like, I believe in myself enough, I believe in this work enough to keep putting it out in the world.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to put details of the memoir competition, the Plaza
Yes.
Prize. We'll put the links down below. But as judge next year, give people a sense of what you'll be looking for. What would what submission is going to make you sit up and take notice?
Yeah. I am very excited. I've never judged anything before. So I feel like I am really looking for what moves me, which is beautiful language. And
Hmm.
I think a story like my story is obviously one that is like, Look at what happened." But like, I don't think that that is required for a fantastic memoir. I think a perspective and a voice that is very unique. I think language that is considered and I personally am a big fan of not flowery by any means, but certainly like poetic and intentional syntax. So I think that's always something
Mm.
that takes me. And then I think in terms of the story, like truth. What is your truth? And how would only you tell it? And I know that that almost can seem like an obvious lead, but I don't think that's true. I think we end up writing to other people's expectations a lot. So, what's your story, and how would you tell it? And like, how is that telling beautiful and uniquely yours?
Mm. I think that's a nice distinction to make, the difference between telling a story for others, trying to sound a certain
Yeah.
way versus saying, how would I myself truly uniquely tell this story? Because I think you can tell the difference, right?
And it also doesn't come easy, right? When we first started talking, you mentioned that it sounded like it was a previous podcast that sounded like just a conversation at the table. I want my book to feel like that, and
Mm.
that is like we all write formally. We all write like, "Here's my story," bum, 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 because that is like the heft of what we're doing, right? Like we are matching the importance of the act, and that is um, how you get started. I think there's a revelatory moment where you're like, "Oh, I should just talk to people." Like, and not your voice is still there, right? But you don't have to craft it when you are speaking, just sort of speaking. And I think that as a at least as a drafting tool is a very helpful thing. Just like talk to me on the page, and I promise out of
Mm.
that will come a more authentic voice that, like you said, you can tell.
Yeah.
And in ways I feel like write it like you would talk to your friend. That's what I did. Annie was my friend before she was my agent. And I think that that is um like how would you tell this story to your best friend that you haven't seen in 10 years and you're like, I've been thinking about something. Like that's going to get you a draft that yields something. Might not be the absolute end game, but it will definitely yield a lot.
Mm. That's a lovely exercise in itself. It's like if you're
Yeah.
going to enter this competition, like Nicole's the judge, she's like,
Yeah.
imagine that you're telling the story to a best friend that you haven't seen for 10 years.
Yeah, certainly. Right, it's like if you're working on a memoir and you're like, I have to generate for this, yeah, I would love that. I think that that would be great. And I also think if you're already working on stuff, it's a good, like you said, a good exercise. Yeah, I'm
Mm.
very excited to read. It's an honor.
Aw. Well, definitely a well-deserved honor for sure.
Yeah, thank you
So
so much, Gabrielle.
talk to us about Wonderland. Tell us like how we can get our hands on it. Obviously, it's not
Mm-hmm.
out yet, but I think that you mentioned there's some pre-order.
Yep. So the book comes out July 9th, and the pre-orders are available now. I will have a little bit more information in the coming, like early January, I think, about what availability might look like in the UK in terms of ordering. But I know you can order the book now via the Simon and Schuster link, which I will send you. I am very excited to hopefully come to the UK. I have a bunch of friends in Belfast and Manchester.
Oh,
So
okay.
and my
And in
husband is from
Salisbury
London.
now.
Oh, very good. Yeah. So, well, let's hang out if I get over there soon. So I'm hoping to do events, more interviews, podcasts, stuff like this up to
Yeah,
July, and then take the book out and have fun with everybody. But yeah, it's available pre-order now. Here's the cover. I have my
it's such a great
actual
cover.
arc now. I know. So this is me, and look at my Uncle Mark's guns.
Oh, that's your uncle, is it?
Yeah, this is my uncle. This is my like family friend forever and ever, and this is my actual uncle, my Uncle Stanley.
Mm,
Yeah, so I'm really
yeah, I love
excited, and
that.
I love that it's coming out with everybody in the family on the cover. That seems so
Yeah.
cool.
So great, Nicole. We'll put the links. And also for people who are watching this who are like, I need more of Nicole, like in my life. Like
Yeah.
what's a platform to reach out to you? Where do
Well,
you
I
show up
live
in those?
at. I do live online. So, yes, I feel like I am on Instagram at Darling Nikki 723 or at Nicole Treska. I now have a book account. And I'm on Twitter at ntreska. And
Okay.
I have a website that has a few of my stories, NicoleTreska.com, has a contact link and links, I believe, to like my Instagram as well.
Okay. We'll put all of those
Yeah,
links below.
absolutely.
So just before we wrap, Nicole, is there something that I didn't ask you that you were like, oh, I really want to talk about this? Like anything that you want to say about the book, the writing process, or even just like somebody out who's made it until this point in the interview. They're still with us.
Yes. Well, I will say, you know what I'll say about the writing process, and I did touch on it, but it takes so long and it takes such passion and madness to pursue that I really think for me, I say in the book at some point, I think from my family, I got the audacity from them, right? Like to do big things. And, I think that we all have the lives that have the capacity for greatness, and that greatness can be, being a fantastic parent. It can be starting over again after a terrible separation. It can be separating yourself from people who don't treat you so great. But like all
Mm.
these things that I think are required to live a big life, and if writing is your thing, that is what you do. I want you to keep going because it takes 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but it is a product of magic and love and madness and all the important stuff. So yeah, I don't know, just keep going. If you're still here, just keep going. That's it.
I love that you left that as a final note because I think people can see, there's a small percentage of writers who do make it quicker. And there's a sense of like, oh, it's taken me more than a decade or it's taking me 15 years. There must be something wrong with me. But actually that message is going to be so heartwarming.
Very quickly, and not to be, I don't know if I think this is a cynical addition to that, but it's, what's wrong with us? We were not born into great wealth that allows us to finish our products in our 20s because we don't have to worry about rent and jobs and children.
Mm,
And like, there's so many things that people who live real lives have to deal with and then write books, right? Like Toni Morrison wrote her
mm,
books at like 5 in the morning because the kids were still asleep and didn't publish until she was in her 40s. So I feel like that reality is really important too. It's like it's not anything wrong with us. It's that we have to try and make art in a world that doesn't care about it or us really. So, you got to just be crazy with it.
be crazy with it.
Be crazy with it.
Nicole, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I've loved chatting with you.
Yes, Gabrielle, thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.